Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of May 9th. And my next guest is someone who's been on the show before, and he's done a lot of wonderful work in Illinois prisons and beyond. He is the one and only Alan Mills of the Uptown People's Law Center. And I saw something came through the email that he had was stepping down from the role of the head guy at the Uptown People's Law Center. He is still doing, work in prisons and beyond. So we're going to talk a little bit about the one and only Alan Mills. Hi, Alan.
Good morning. It's always a pleasure to be on the show.
I'm glad you accepted my invitation. How about telling us a little bit about the Uptown People's Law Center, some current things that they're up to, and your decision to step down from being the head honcho, let's say, and talk a little bit about some of your experiences while you've been in that role.
Sure. So the Uptown People's Law Center is a not-for-profit storefront legal clinic, started way back in the mid-1970s as part of a much larger organization, which was loosely associated with the Black Panther Party as a survival program, one of many, along with an education program and a breakfast program and all those sorts of health clinic, all those sorts of things. The Uptown People's Law Center is the last surviving of those various organizations. We're still rooted very deeply in the Uptown community, but our work now extends beyond Uptown. So we do housing work, mostly focused on Uptown, that is representing tenants who are being evicted, and other landlord-tenant problems. We represent people who are disabled, who have been denied Social Security disability benefits. That includes people from Uptown as well as anybody who was formerly incarcerated, whose Social Security benefits are related to their, the disabilities related to the fact they spent time in prison. And then finally, we represent prisoners throughout the state of Illinois. That work really began because people from Uptown, being poor, are the ones who ended up in prison. So the people who founded the Uptown People's Law Center followed the steps of the Black Panther Party, saying, hey, these people are still part of our community. They may be taken away by the state and incarcerated somewhere else, but they're still our brothers, our sisters, our mothers and fathers, our sons and daughters. So therefore, they're still part of our community. So they should be part of our community work. We started with people from Uptown who went to prison, but since then it's expanded because for many years, really nobody in the state of Illinois was representing prisoners on an ongoing basis. Partly because the United States Congress, back under Bill Clinton in the 1990s, said that anybody who gets federal money can't represent prisoners. And then the ACLU of Illinois for years stepped away from prisons and focused on jails and juveniles. And we were sort of the last people left. So we ended up doing several large class action cases, as well as dozens of individual cases on behalf of prisoners. I started at the Uptown People's Law Center back in 1979 as a second-year law student volunteer. And never left. I worked my way up from being a volunteer to being a part-time attorney volunteer. And then in 1991 became a staff attorney. And a couple of years later, they changed my label to legal director. But at that point, I was the only attorney. So I was sort of directing myself at that point. But somebody in the board said, well, other organizations have legal directors, so we want one too. So I became the legal director. And then almost exactly 10 years ago, our longtime legal director or executive director, Belinda Belcher, who grew up in the Uptown community and came from coal mining stock, passed away unexpectedly. And the board persuaded me, sort of involuntarily at the beginning, to take on the executive director role, which meant a lot more administration and a lot less litigation, although I continue to do litigation. And then about a year ago, I announced to the board that I really had enough after 45 years of working at the Uptown People's Law Center. Didn't want to be in charge anymore, but very much wanted to continue to fight. And therefore, I wanted to stay on as a part-time staff attorney back where I started, working on some cases, but not responsible for anything.
Well, Alan Mills, tell us what some of the most impactful case that you had in your history of all those years working up there.
I focus on two, one loss and one win. Our loss was actually the first big class action case we did, which was about access to the courts for people in solitary confinement. That started when somebody from Uptown wrote us, said that they filed this big case all by themselves, about trying to get to the law library at the old Joliet prison, and had been threatened that if they asked to go to the law library anymore, they would be written up and sent to solitary. Both he and his partner were spending long times in solitary and really had no way to get to the court. So they wrote us and said, we filed this case, and now the state's going to come down and they do this thing called a deposition. And we don't know really what that is, but we know the state's going to ask us questions under oath. And I remember from my criminal case, if the state's going to ask you questions under oath, you should have a lawyer there. So can you come down and represent me in this deposition thing? So it grew from that into a statewide class action case about solitary. It went on for 18 years. 3 different judges ruled that the current system was unconstitutional. And then our wonderful Supreme Court changed the rules of what are called standing, that is, who has the right to bring these cases. And ultimately, the court decided that our 2 named plaintiffs hadn't tried hard enough to get to the law library and therefore never had standing to bring the case in the first place, and threw the entire case out after 18 years of litigation and 3 partial victories. So in one way, that was a huge loss. On the other hand, it turns out that if you want to meet a lot of jailhouse lawyers, that's the way to do it, because we were in contact with all those people trying to get to the library. So we met hundreds of prisoners through that action, and they all started writing us with all the other problems they had. So it was really from that case that our entire prison practice grew into a statewide practice rather than being one just focused on Uptown. Almost immediately after that case, Illinois opened Tams Correctional Center, our supermax prison. So again, really it's just solitary on steroids. It was a prison built from ground up to minimize contact between human beings, so that people were really and truly isolated. And we represented a couple of people who got sent there. We're upset that our clients had been sent down to this hellhole, and decided to start investigating. It turned out the prison was full of former gang members, people who just were a pain in the ass to the administration, usually by filing lawsuits or lots and lots of grievances, and people who are seriously mentally ill. So we filed a class action lawsuit saying that, first of all, conditions at Tams were terrible, and second of all, people were being sent there in retaliation for their speaking out, basically. That case also went on for over a decade, but in the end, we won. We won saying that they had to have hearings, due process, which is now in the news very much on the immigration side. As we've been reading, Trump has said, well, people who are being deported don't get due process. And they were saying the same thing in prison, that people who were sent to this whole hall weren't entitled to due process, weren't entitled to any sort of hearing to prove they didn't do anything wrong. The judge disagreed, ordered due process hearings. And at the beginning of those hearings, of course, the defendant said, everybody belongs here. Every single prisoner lost that hearing eventually. But then we noticed a pattern that sort of 6 months after they lost the hearing, they get transferred out of Tams. So after a year, Governor Quinn decided that he would just close Tams entirely, partly because of our lawsuit, but partly because of some really good community organizing that was going on, and partly, frankly, because it was really expensive to run. So those 3 things came together, and we closed Tams. So in that sense, I think that case was one of the most impactful ones we've ever done. It was also, from my mind, the best example of good community lawyering, where the case dovetailed in with a political movement that was happening on the ground. And that, I think, has always been the philosophy of the Uptown People's Law Center, is that we don't expect society to change through the courts, but we think the courts are providing another, what I think of as a table, a negotiating table, a place to bring people together, a mechanism in order to empower people to fight for change for themselves. And that's what really happened at Tams. We provided the catalyst, not only for the prisoners inside to fight for themselves, but for their family members, and then eventually for the community at large to fight for it. So in that sense, not only did we win the case, but I think we played an important role in a much more community struggle, which built power among people who were in prison as well as their loved ones on the outside. So that, I think, has always been the goal of the Uptown People's Law Center, and Tams is by far our most successful case for that.
Let me ask you, you mentioned that the ACLU and Clinton had, they made it harder to deal with the prisoners. And what are the ramifications of those decisions they made?
Well, Illinois, according to one study done by a professor at the University of Michigan, Illinois was the only state in the country that did not have a consent decree governing its prisons for about 25 years, from the 1980 to about the early 2000s. Not a single one. And that's because there weren't enough lawyers here doing that work. Partly because Clinton made it much harder, both by saying federal money couldn't use that way, also passing what's known as the Prison Litigation Reform Act, And while it's called a Reform Act, its real purpose was to suppress the number of cases that are brought by prisoners. So, for example, lots of lawyers who basically were civil rights lawyers, did both police misconduct cases and prisoner misconduct cases. After the Prison Litigation Reform Act passed, they mostly stopped doing any prison cases. Not that Chicago doesn't have lots of police problems, so there's plenty of work to do on the police side, but it was much easier and more lucrative to bring those cases. And therefore, lots and lots of lawyers stopped doing the prison side and started doing the police side. It also became harder to win those cases, and therefore some of the not-for-profit lawyers, including the ACLU, as well as several of the law school legal clinics, really shut down their prison practice for a couple of decades. And we were the last one standing.
Are there more people in prison now? What's the status of the Illinois prisons? I may as well bring it up right now, in the movement, which, for me, that's since the early 60s, being involved in progressive politics. There was a time when there was a lot of attention to prisons. And, you remember George Jackson and his brother, they tried to escape, and there was, a lot of things came down, but there was a lot of activity on the prison reform front. And I know there are some people doing that now, but can you share a little bit about where that is at? There definitely is a need. There are a lot more people in prison, I'm assuming, and not so many people willing to help out and not so much pressure from the outside. Am I hitting it on the head here?
So, clearly you're right. There are more people in prison. The number of people in prison peaked in the early 2000s at about 7 times the number of prisoners that there were in prison in the early 1970s. We went from about 300,000 people in prison nationwide to about 2.1 million. Since then, it's dropped a little bit, so we're just under 2 million now. But still, compared to where we were in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it's just a huge system. And of course, the number of people with criminal records is much, much larger than that. Not everybody ends up in prison. They go through jail. They don't get arrested. They don't get charges. So the number of people now who have criminal records in the United States is astounding, more so than any other country in the world, either by percentage of our population or just raw numbers. So places like China and India, many times our population, have smaller number of people in prison, and no country comes close to us in terms of the percentage of people that we lock up in our prisons. It's an experiment in mass incarceration, which is unprecedented in the history of the world. Even places like Russia during the Stalin times didn't lock up nearly as many people. Places like South Africa during the height of apartheid didn't lock up as high a percentage of Black people as we do. So it is really it's unprecedented, this movement. So I think the good news is that there's beginning to be that same sort of groundswell among activists. A lot of it's focused on the police, I admit. The idea of abolition now is back on the radar. People forget that back in the late 1960s, there was a real discussion happening about whether or not prisons had outlived their useful purpose and should be shrunk. Instead, we vastly expanded them. Even the Department of Justice put out a white paper saying prisons are not working, we should try something else, back in 1968. That was a long time ago. But we forgot all that. Instead, we multiplied it by many times, and it hasn't gotten any better. In many ways, it's gotten worse. So, I think that the lesson here is all of the reforms that have happened over the last 30, 40 years have really been overwhelmed by the increasing number of people in prison. Illinois is doing better than some. We capped out our prison system at about 50,000 people, just under 50,000 people. Governor Rauner, for all of the problems he had, did cut down the number of people in prison significantly, got it down to about 40,000. And then during the pandemic, the current Governor Pritzker got it down under 30,000 and has at least pledged publicly that that's where they want to keep it. It's creeping up a little bit now, but we're still right about 30,000, which compared to 50,000 is a significant drop. So we've made some progress in Illinois in terms of incarcerating people. And there's lots of groundswell now, in part driven by people in prison who are organizing the people on the outside. Parole Illinois, for example, is one organization which was really started by a group of men at Stateville Correctional Center, and then organized people on the outside. So it's moving. Decarcerate Illinois is another one that started in prison and moved to the outside. And then there's some that have started with police and have moved on to the prison issues. I think the Chicago Community Bond Fund had a lot to do with raising this issue. particularly with the jail, the number of people that are incarcerated pre-trial. They did not only bonding people out, but also ended up eliminating cash bail entirely in the state. So I think there has been a groundswell here. And I think the proof of that is the last governor's election, where the only issue the Republicans really had was this so-called purge, how the governor's going to let everybody out of prison, and he was soft on crime, and everybody was there were going to be riots in the street, and crime would skyrocket. And of course, the Republicans got slaughtered in that election, and there has been no spike in crime. In fact, crime continues to go down. So, I think that there is some movement out here, but it's nothing like it used to be. There is no real dedicated activism around prison like there used to be, either by the Black Panther Party or many other of those sort of radical left who focused on prisons before.
Are there any positive programs going on within prison these days? Do people have access to books? Do they have any kind of education, physical activity? What's going on inside?
Inside is a disaster right now. The state will tell you that the problem is that they're understaffed. I say that there's no such thing as understaffing, that the problem is over incarceration. But there's no question that the ratio of staff, whether it be medical or mental health or security, to the number of prisoners we have is low. And that means that most people in prison now are spending the vast majority of the day, we're talking about like 20 plus hours a day, locked in their cells with nothing to do. Not for punishment, just because they've eliminated all the programming. The number of classes that are being held, the number of mental health groups that are being held, just plain old going to the yard has been eliminated almost entirely at lots and lots of our prisons, including medium security prisons, and even beginning to trickle down to the minimum security prisons, where people used to be out of their cells 16 hours a day. They're now lucky to get out 4. So it really is a disaster. I think the tip of that iceberg is the mental health and medical care that's being provided in this system. The number of doctors is abysmally low. 50% of the number of doctors that the Department of Corrections says it needs, and that's probably not enough, but even the ones they say they need are vacant. So only have half the number of doctors that even the department says they need. Same with nurses, 50% vacancy rate. And that just means that no doctor can do that kind of work, no matter how well intentioned they are. And it also makes it impossible to attract the best doctors, because they're just being placed in an overwhelming situation where their main job is to fill out pieces of paper, not actually treat people.
So am I correct that there are fewer advocates for prisoners than there used to be?
It depends on when you're talking about. So I'd say there are a lot more than there were 15 years ago. There are a lot less than there were 50 years ago.
Let me throw this one at you. What's your take on the sending of supposed gang members to El Salvador, and in the news today, now Libya, they're talking about it. Your thoughts on the general horrendous situation that we have going on in our country now about expelling people, throwing them out of the country, deporting them, whatever it's called?
Yeah, in some ways, it's the most dangerous thing that's ever happened in this country, at least in my lifetime. The president has admitted that he's not willing to give due process to these folks. And that, while that's a technical legal term, due process, what it means is you have no right to fight it. So we've already seen that they've sent people who are legally in the United States, snatched them off the street, and sent them to hell in El Salvador. There was an interesting speculative article yesterday. Could the president deport Obama? Yes, he could. There's a whole question of whether or not he was born in this country. There's another question of whether or not his father had legal status at the time he was conceived in this country. If they end birthright citizenship, then they could argue even if Obama was in fact born here, his father was illegal, and therefore he was an anchor baby, and therefore subject to deportation. If you don't have a chance to defend yourself, then all it takes is somebody coming to your door, grabbing you, putting you on a plane, and sending you away. Doesn't matter if you're a United States citizen or not. Due process means you don't have a chance to defend yourself. You don't have a chance to make a case. Try making that case from El Salvador prison or Libya or any other country that they want to send people to. It's the most dangerous thing in the world. Due process sounds all nice and a real technical problem. It's one of those technical things that only lawyers care about until you're subject to it and you say, hey, somebody has to listen to me. And they don't.
I'm going to ask you, who are some of your most memorable clients that you've had over the years?
Well, I think number one has to be Brian Nelson. Brian Brian went into prison as a juvenile, had lots and lots of problems, I have to say, adjusting to prison. Ultimately ended up on what they called the circuit, where they moved him every couple of days from one prison to another, sent him out of state altogether in New Mexico, where, interestingly enough, despite the fact he was labeled as sort of the worst of the worst here in Chicago, in Illinois, in New Mexico, he was treated as a minimum security prisoner, working in a tailor shop, access to people's cars, et cetera, et cetera. Then when they opened TAMS, they came and snatched him out of New Mexico, flew him to back to Illinois, put him in TAMS, where he spent almost 10 years in solitary. I met him very early on, back in this original case that I was talking about, access to the libraries, when he just went into prison, and stayed in touch throughout his whole journey. When he was released finally from prison, he came to work for us at the Uptown People's Law Center for about a decade. My most memorable thing from him, though, was not when he was working for us, but when he was trying to assert his religious rights in prison. He was raised Catholic, just here in Uptown, St. Benedict's. He went to high school there. And when he was in prison, he said, well, let me figure out who this St. Benedict was. I went to their school all day, but I have no idea who he was. So he began to read about it and then realized he was a monk and that there were various rules. He tried to live by those rules. One of those rules was you had to do productive labor. So he started copying out the Bible. And he tried to have meatless Fridays, and they said, no, you're not allowed to do that. So he sued. We represented him. I went down to, again, for his deposition, and they had actually built a courtroom inside TAMS, so you didn't have to move anybody out for anything. You could actually do trials inside TAMS. So I went into this courtroom, sat down, shook his hand, and we did the deposition. I got back to my office, and a week later got a letter from Brian saying, you don't understand what just happened. Your shaking my hand was the first time in 8 years that I felt another person's skin on my skin. And you don't know how hard it was to stay calm during this deposition, because I was freaking out that somebody actually touched me. And that just drove home to me just how isolating a place can be in solitary, where you never feel another person's skin. That's just so incredibly inhumane. So that's what I remember. That I will never forget that about Brian. My other story is a little different. We were touring a lot of prisons, and a lot of people know my name in prisons because I'm doing this work for so long, but they don't necessarily know what I look like. So often I can walk around a prison for a while before people figure out who I am. But eventually people say, oh, this is Alan Mills, and they start yelling out in the gallery. Alan Mills is on the gallery, and then everyone wants to talk to me. So I was touring this one medium security prison downstate, and everybody was yelling out. But one person in particular had sort of organized a bunch of people around him saying, you got to go to cell, whatever it was, 120. So finally I get there, and he says, I don't want anything from you. What I want to tell you is, I know you've talked to everybody in this tier. There's probably 100 people here, and you've told it, most of them know you can't help them on their individual thing, and we understand that. And everybody's mad at you. But I want you to know when you leave, how proud we are that you're here. Because I went into the system 25 years ago, and you were already a legend. Everybody knew who you were. Here you are 25 years later, and you're still here. You never go away. You always fight the Department of Corrections. No other lawyer does that. And now you're making house calls to our cells. So that kind of, and I had never represented him. I didn't know him from a hole in the wall. He was just somebody who knew me for all these years in prison. So that really drove home how important it is just to stand up and talk for people in prison. And as lawyers, we have this nifty little card that says we're lawyers that gives us the right to go into prison and talk to people.
We got a couple minutes left, and I'm going to ask you about white supremacy and that movement in prison. It kind of quickly, but I remember from my Rising Up Angry days dealing with the TJO gang, and there were Gansey and Callis. And I believe Callis is still in prison if he didn't die, but he developed a rep as a pretty formidable white supremacist guy. And I'm just wondering, ideally, in the movement, we like the idea of rainbow and people of different, Latin, Black, Native American, white people getting along. I'm sure there are a lot more Black and Latin people and Latinos in prison than whites. But is there a strong, any kind of rainbow activity, or is there an overwhelming white supremacy activity when it's possible?
No, I think that there's very much more of a rainbow activity. TAMS, again, was the key of that. They organized a hunger strike, which included every race in the prison. It was successful, about 95% participation rate, and they really supported each other and organized together. The same thing happened with the various groups that I talked about, Pro Illinois, Decarcerate Illinois, which started inside. That was very much a multiracial rainbow sort of coalition. I think the white supremacy currently exists inside prison, but you mentioned the TGAOs, one of which was Joe Gansey, I believe, who was the first client that I talked about in terms of taking me to prison. Was Joe Gansey, who on the outside was very much part of that white group, but the case he filed was with a black person who grew up in Robert Taylor homes, and they became close allies because they realized the prison system was their enemy, not each other.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on, and I know you're going to keep working at this stuff, so we'll have you back on, and anytime you want to come on, you let me know.